Welcome back to Temple Emmanuel. Happy Hanukkah. We are coming up to Parasha Miketz, the parsha that's always read during Hanukkah. And it is the story of Pharaoh waking up, having had these two weird dreams about cows eating each other and shafts of wheat consuming each other. And of course, as we know, Pharaoh's courtier, who had been restored to his position just as Joseph had predicted, gets recommended to Pharaoh as an interpreter of dreams because Pharaoh has had these dreams and no one in his court is able to interpret them for him. None of them are able to find the pitaron, which really doesn't mean interpretation, but really means the solution, finding out what the solution is. And of course, Joseph is dragged out of jail. He gets new clothing. He gets a shave, according to the biblical text. I think it's the first shave recorded in the Bible, maybe the first shave recorded in human history at a barber shop, like in The Wizard of Oz, where they fixed you up after your long journey. And Joseph comes before Pharaoh and interprets the dreams, and he tells Pharaoh that there's going to be a cycle, an economic cycle of boom and bust, boom and bust. And of course, Pharaoh is thrilled to understand what the dream is and to have a solution to that dream. As the story goes on, Joseph is installed as the second most powerful person in Egypt. And he's there because he's a guy who finds solutions. It's not so much the interpretation of the dream, but Pharaoh taps into Joseph's talent to build store cities, to collect enough from the farmers of Egypt so that there is enough food stored away, a form of a tax, so that the Pharaoh can turn that back to his people after the good years are over and the famine appears. So Joseph is more of a political operator than anything else. He is actually put in charge of buying up all the land for Pharaoh, which is the seamier side of the story that we don't always talk about. But if we think about the overall arch of the biblical narrative, it turns out that Joseph, the problem solver, the solution that Joseph finds, is not just the solution to Pharaoh's immediate administrative and political needs, but it's a solution to a lot of other problems as well. A lot of problems that perhaps were hidden from Joseph. For example, God's intent is to create the people of Israel. Up until this point, we had Jacob, who becomes Israel. But what about Jacob's sons, this ragtag group of unruly brothers who sometimes act worse than poorly? How is this group going to be turned into a nation that works together? The answer to that problem was, of course, the 400 years in Egypt. We don't know exactly what happened during those 400 years, but we know that we come out as a people, the biological as well as the non-biological spiritual descendants of Jacob come out as Israel. And so the problem of how does Jacob's family become a nation is also being solved as part of the Joseph story. But then there are also hidden troubles. For example, Joseph is what we call the positional Jew. He's used by Pharaoh to buy up the land of the impoverished Egyptians. And on some level, the fact that Joseph was the instrument of Pharaoh and his priests who wind up owning all of the land is understandable then that some years later, perhaps the Hebrews are not exactly considered the best friends of the Egyptian population because they fronted for the Pharaoh in his nefarious collection of the property of all of the Egyptians. And so in Joseph's interpretation and in his solution, there are more solutions that were hidden, and there are also problems that were hidden as well. Joseph is very clever. When Pharaoh is impressed with his dream solving, Joseph says, look, the solution doesn't come from me, but it comes from God. And in fact, this is an important lesson. When we have ourselves in a situation that seems insurmountable, or even a situation that is surmountable, but difficult, but challenging, We as Jews understand that there is always a pitaron, that there's always some kind of a solution. Whether that's a political problem or a family problem, an emotional issue, there's always a solution. And there are solutions that we see, like the ones Joseph offered Pharaoh, and then there are those hidden solutions, those hidden ways in which things tend to resolve themselves that may not be apparent to us. They certainly weren't apparent to a tzaddik and a prophet such as Joseph was. And that's the important thing about this Shabbat's reading. It's also the important message of Hanukkah. I doubt that the Judeans at the beginning of the 2nd century before the Common Era understood that their problem of oppression under the Greek Empire was going to be solved by the Maccabees. And they certainly had no way of knowing, as Elias Bickerman taught us, that the war that they were engaged in is what ultimately led to the creation, a couple hundred years later, of Rabbinic Judaism and the preservation of our people, even in the face of the loss of sovereignty and in the collapse of the old temple system of worshiping God. Our Haftarah from Zechariah has the famous line. It says, Lo b'chayil v'lo b'koach, ki im beruchi amar Adonai tzavaot. That it will not be by chayil, by military might, or by koach, by physical power, but rather by the wind of God. Joseph understood this, and it will help us to understand that while some solutions are obvious to us in the physical world, by the koach, the physical beings that we are, even by military might, the real solutions, the real salvation comes beruach, in the wind, which is much more ethereal and hard to discern. Enjoy the rest of your Hanukkah and have a great Shabbat.